We are live. Okay, we're back in Kerbal Space Program 1 with working on some KOS scripting. And I believe where I left off, I needed to put up some satellites for communications so I could assure connectivity as I started to explore Moon. So that involved a couple of things. First was getting a satellite in position and having it do some precision station keeping, so that other satellites could go up and also do precision station keeping so that the satellite constellation itself would maintain coverage. It does no good to set up a bunch of satellites that are nicely spread out in their orbits and have them kind of wander around because their periods aren't right. So I grabbed hold of the existing code for launching satellites, and then I looked at the code that I was using for rendezvous and rescue, where I was having my RCS jets do a very fine control over my position and my velocity. And what I worked out was it was very simple to correct the velocity of the satellite in the end. Let me bring that up. It's actually very short code. There's my editor. Make that a little more centered. And in ComSat 3, here. So the name of the satellite is going to be C/03/000. That's C for communication satellite, 03 for configuration 3. And inside that, there's going to be the next 3 digits is going to be the phase offset from the start. So 000 is going to go up. He's going to be my anchor point. Wherever he is, that's the 0 point. And when 060 goes up, it'll try to be 60 degrees ahead of him. I'm not going to do that by angle. I'm going to do that by fraction of a period. So 0 to 360 would be forward by some fraction, because I want this to work when it's a non-circular orbit. And if you're in a highly elliptical orbit and you're 10 degrees ahead over here, then you're going to be 30 degrees ahead over there. So you can't do it based on the angle, but I'm still using 0 to 360 for the whole way around. This may be the difference in the mean anomaly, but that's kind of off to the side of where we are. So just think of it as 1/6 of the way ahead. Anyway, so what we do is we have a normal satellite launch, including launches up to beyond the target altitude and then circularize at the altitude. I believe I've gone over this, I'm not sure, but circ at is the normal circularization. It says find when we're going to be at a given altitude, and when we get there, start trying to correct our velocity to be circular. When we're all done, we're going to drop into this hold area where we're going to report using debug. So I can take this out later, but using debug, we're going to report what our observed period is and our target period. So we've got set our target period from before, what the error is. And if the error in the period is bigger than 0.1 second, that seems awfully small, but bear with me here. You'll see how small they get. Then I'm going to use my RCS controller to adjust my velocity. And there's the computation right there. Again, it starts out with, if the error is small enough, return a 0. Observe my velocity. And then what would my velocity be right now if I was either at the apoapsis or periapsis of an orbit that had the correct semi-major axis? That's how correcting your SMA is how you get the period perfect. So I want to correct my SMA. I just don't want to go in a circular orbit where I am, because if I'm too high, then my orbit's going to be too long. So I compute my altitude and the altitude on the other side of the orbit to get the right SMA, get the desired speed at my current altitude from vis viva, compute the velocity, which is my current velocity, excluding any component in the direction of my position. That gets me the direction, and multiply that by the speed. So this is just the same thing as I do in the circularization code. There's the dV, and we pass the dV back on to RCS. and these velocities tend to be very small. The dominant portion of this will be the first time we come in, we'll have approximately the right SMA, but our velocity is going to be wrong because we're not circular. So what this will tend to do is if we've got the wrong period, it will not only tend to correct our period, but it will do so in a way that minimizes our eccentricity. So my perfect orbit is a circular orbit that's exactly the right period. And we will try to approach that, and this will be the correction factor. Now, if our period is within 1/10 of a second of correct, we're going to assume everything else is cool, and we're just going to neutralize controls, turn our RCS off, turn our SAS off, turn our throttle off, and lock our steering to a very specific constant attitude. So if we time warp and we come out of time warp and we're already at that attitude, we will not maneuver. If I tried to set this up so that we are always facing Kerbin and we time warp, when we come out of time warp, we'll have to adjust. What I'm trying to do here is minimize the amount of maneuvering we do when we are close to the correct orbit. This will conserve our RCS fuel in the long run and will minimize how much energy we spend spinning our wheels to adjust our attitude. So that's the only special thing I did for the first rocket launch. Let's go ahead and launch it. Turn off the editor here. I have been KSPing for a while today, so it's probably got a whole bunch of extra cruft set up. Expect to see longer delays when it's doing those scene shifts. So here's our first relay satellite, C03000. So the 000 says I'm the lead element. And that's saved already, so we're just going to hit launch. So this should be a completely automated launch. So all the way from the ground, all the way up to being on orbit, and circularizing and then fine-tuning. It's that last step, that fine-tuning that we want to test. Come on, KSP, you can do it. I probably should have rebooted it before I started the stream. Just for grins, we're going to turn on the debug console while this runs. And let me make that a bit bigger. There we go. So I still have some debug stuff in here that comes out on the console from time to time. Not a lot of it. I'm eliminating the debug printouts in the areas that seem to be robust and not breaking. I am still fiddling around with the autostager. There's some question as to whether I've got an off by one error at the end or not. I want to make sure that it doesn't trigger my parachutes that are in stage 0, but I do want to trigger the decoupler that's in stage 1. Now, this particular flight, we aren't going to test that because our last, we've got our last engine is in stage 0. We've got decouplers in 1 and 2. So this really isn't a fair test. Besides, we'll be staging on through that with a light and call rather than the autostager. So anyway, I'm just chatting at this point. There are some ascent programs I've seen out there where people will limit their speed through the atmosphere and they don't get the heating. I am not sure that's a good idea or not. I think I save a little bit of fuel by just going ahead and bluffing my way through and letting it heat up as long as things don't burn. The one thing I want to be sure of is that I don't lose any solar panels on the way up, because that would be unfortunate. Especially bad if we lost any antenna, but they're kind of tucked in. So behind us we see the sun and Mun, and we're getting a sunset here. Oh, this configuration of this rocket, it's kind of back heavy. So after I do the initial burn to transition out to orbit, I will be discarding this last thing because just, like that. Oh, I'm doing it before. Okay, that works too. If I didn't have enough fuel for the transition burn, it was going to discard it. The thing is that if we still had that clamp to our back on the way out... Oh, was that the burn? That was the burn already. Going faster than I thought. Oh, right. For this one, it just goes straight out. Yeah, the thing is that with that big tail thing, burning the RCS to rotate also accelerates me, which means if I point myself prograde and then work out a correction orbit and then rotate myself to some other attitude, I've changed my orbit. So we're going to be using the satellite configuration for all of our real proper tuning here. That'll be noticeable in the next launch. Right now we're just waiting for the circularization, and it will do just a seat of the pants. When I start burning, we're just going to circularize wherever we are. This particular circularization doesn't really know. I've asked it to start the circularization at the right altitude, but it's not going to be trying to fix the SMA. It's just going to circularize. Maybe I could do it the other way. I don't know. The trick is that I do want to do this circularization with the main engine here, because he has a whole bunch of fuel. We'll be using the RCS for our corrections, and perhaps we should do something where we check, and if the correction is big enough, we'll go ahead and point and use our main engine instead of RCS. But there we are. We are done. It actually did that burn based on the maneuver node, so it did a planned circularization using a maneuver node, which is inherently approximate. We get ourselves set up and we say, oh, look at all the RCS jets. Okay, so we had to correct with the RCS, and I am not printing out how much that correction is, but our period error is 3 hours. So it might be prudent, depends on how much RCS burn I get going here. This is not coming down very fast. Yeah, this is actually a new thing. So I'm going to revert that real quick. Let me put in a little step here to do a circularization that does a better job of getting us circularized here. So we plan at, we plan go, and we came out of this and we weren't really very circular. So we want to do the other half of circularization. Now some other rockets still do this. There's phase circ, and then there's, yeah, it's phase circ that does this. I'm going to grab phase circ. We're just going to slide it right in here. So phase circ will, I did this right. Phase circ just simply says circularize wherever we are using the main engine. So this could circularize with a slightly wrong SMA, but it's after we've done this first step, so we should be at approximately the right altitude anyway. And we'll be diving into correcting with RCS afterwards. So now we've made that change, revert to launch. Yeah, I didn't want to sit here with this correcting us by 5 minutes of period for 5 seconds. That would take a while. Good thing I was watching the debug console. So now we sit here and watch it do the same thing all over again. That's going to be 5 minutes of twiddling our thumbs. Did I show? I didn't show what I did with that edit, did I? Basically, what I did was, this is the circularization method that I've had for quite some time. oops. Let's make it fit on the screen here. Okay, there's a circularization code. And all I've done is I went into my script and I said, after we do this plan circularization at the altitude and run the plan, I've just added a thing that says, when we get here, tweak our orbit so it's really very circular. And that uses the main engine. Then when we drop into the hold, we'll be using the RCS to tune it, and we know that we are roughly circular. We may have to correct our period a little bit, but it should be a much smaller correction now. Let me see if I need to do that in the other. There's actually two Go scripts that are going to be involved here. There's this one that I was just showing, which is the generic script, well, the script for the lead element. But there's a separate script for the non-lead element, which I will go ahead and tweak up. There we go. Yeah, it needed it as well. Its code looks very similar. There's a little bit of extra stuff in the middle. In that case, it will circularize at 80 kilometers and wait and then until the right phase and get itself up in the right place. We'll see that in a moment. So here's what we've done. We did our ascent, which got our apoapsis out far enough. We then went through our lighten phase, which says discard everything but the last stage. And now we're going to go out and circularize. And we did this much. This is a planned circularization using that maneuver node. And this says we have altitude of 4,062 kilometers. And this says burn altitude is 4063. So we are starting the maneuver at about the right altitude. That tells me that when we do switch over, wait a minute, 4,000. That seems wrong. I may have added an R0 instead of subtracting it? I've done this a few times lately. Yep, altitude is SMA plus R0. So, we go back to the beginning again. And yeah, let's show you on the code. Oops. This is the oops right here. That was a plus. So what's happened is I sent us up too high by twice the radius of the planet. Oh, not good. That was one of the reasons why that correction was so big. See, the period error is still huge here because literally we circularized 600 kilometers, no, 1,200 kilometers too high. That was our problem. Yeah, I did not run this. I ran one quick check of this before starting, but I didn't notice that it was doing all these things. It's only when you actually watch it happen and describe it to people as it's happening you notice bugs like this. I should probably set my debug console up to default to a bigger font here. Default font size 20. And default width is, how about 50 by 32? Well, that's about right. It probably won't do that until the next time we boot. Anyway, that'll keep the console coming up. Oh, I left my editor going. There we go. I have to remember to glance up and keep track of whether I've got my code editor showing in OBS or not. There's our rather severe heating on our, yeah, I may want to think about limiting my speed through the atmosphere during that ascent. Pretty typically, I've got a big negative angle of attack, which means that I am burning too hard too fast early on for the curve that I want for my grav turn. The other thing about this grav turn I'm using is that I'm not appreciably increasing my periapsis until very late. Okay, there's the lighten. And we reorient for the next burn and swing out to it. So that's better. 2.857, 2.869. Yeah. So I've been trying for roughly turbosynchronous. It's not truly important to be turbosynchronous because I'm going to have 6 satellites up, which gives more than enough coverage for everything. It's not that I'm putting up one satellite that needs to be right over KSP. So notice he's pointed in. We are actually circularizing before our apoapsis rather significantly. So we launched to a very high apoapsis. I'm wondering if I've got that plus R0 in there twice again. Target altitude is SMA minus R0. Okay. So we go down here. Launch altitude is target SMA plus 1,000. So our launch altitude is too high. That's a copy-paste error. It is one that gets corrected, so I will not relaunch with this. But yeah, that's going to cost us fuel. And that is probably in the other script as well. So we fixed this part earlier. The other one was where we were setting launch altitude. This was target SMA, literally target SMA. So we go to the other Go script and I check the same thing. SMA is center major axis, altitude is SMA minus R0. This uses a launch reconfiguration. This comes from our rescue missions. And this actually reconfigures us based on our target. But this gives us a low. Oh, we'll get into this later. So this went by without me noticing it, but we very quickly corrected in our period error. Steady state is like 1/10 of a second off. And the only reason it isn't getting any better is we have code in the script that says if it's within 2/10 of a second or so, I think it's 2/10 of a second. If it's close enough, we don't do anything. So if the absolute value of the period is greater than 0.1, we'll correct it. Otherwise, we leave it alone. So these guys actually were getting some RCS changes. I don't think. Nope, we cannot scroll back. Shall I do one more launch? I'm going to do one more launch so we can see this. Getting this first launch good and showing what it's doing is really the key thing here. But given that we had the proper orbit on the last one, if this launch doesn't screw up royally, we'll just keep it. And I will give us longer text here. There we go. So before we launch our first follower, I'm going to go over the script really quick and check target SMA and target altitude and make sure that we are launching to just above the altitude instead of over the SMA and all of that. We can, as you saw from that previous flight, we can correct when our apoapsis is way, way, way too high. But it does cost us quite a bit of fuel. And while we have a good chunk of fuel, we've got about 1350 meters per second of delta V in our final stage. I'd really prefer to just, have that available in case we want to change an orbit. Now, there is another way of setting these satellites up. The reason why I want to do one at a time like this is now, if I've got 6 satellites up there and I want to replace one, I can just say, well, launch satellite, 120, and it will launch another satellite into position 120. I can delete the old one and replace it and have a new satellite up there in no time. If I had a multi-satellite launcher, which went up, dropped one, looped around, dropped a second, looped around, dropped a third, I would still need this logic if I wanted to replace one of the ones out of the middle. Not a huge deal in KSP because you don't have one in the middle fail. But let's say the coding was wrong, or let's say I used up too much RCS fuel in one of my satellites. Replacing it is a way to get things going again. Okay, so circularization planned. Burn vector is 475 meters per second of delta V. Where'd Kerbin go? Oh, there it is. So we're going to inflate, and once this circularizes, it's going to drop right into the station keeping code. And I wanted to see the first few corrections that the RCS does. This is going to be fairly close. 2862, that's about the right altitude for my target orbits. But there's going to be some fine-tuning here. These main engines can never get things exactly on. So we come up. We get ourselves posed properly. And there we go. So our total error was 2.15 seconds in period. And we have corrected it down to 0.181. So this error isn't going away. But that's all right. It's a very small error. We are still attempting to correct it because you notice that the absolute error is not less than 0.1 seconds. But it's not going to fire the RCS jets because the computed correction for delta V is too small. Literally, we would be running the RCS jets at almost zero. There is code in the control stuff for saying if you want, it has a 5% dead band. And if you want less than that, it will do 5% briefly and come down. But we're even smaller than that. Let's take a look at that code real quick. Control RCSDV. So basically, we compute what percentage of RCS we would like to get. If it's less than 1%, we neutralize. If it's less than 10%, then we're going to go ahead and fire at 10%. So this means that to correct this small of an error, we would need less than 1% of our RCS to do the error correction. And again, I forgot to turn on the editor. There we go. So this is the correction code that I'm using. This is the code from the rescue stuff where we were approaching our rescuee and then stopping near them. So this delta V wanted to get us with a slow enough velocity that I could hop over and jetpack back, and everything was visually, it was standing still. So yeah, over the long run, yeah, okay. So our current error, if we look back at our code, not our code, at our logs, this is about 1/6 of a second. So 6 times around. So in 6 days, I will be 1 second out of my, 1 second out of position. That's pretty good. So that's the first satellite. Whoops, I just hit an N. Okay, RCS jets in the N direction do what? So I perturbed our orbit slightly. Well, it'll correct it. It would correct it if it needed a correction. We are at 2862763, 2863970. So this is nearly circular, and my correction did specifically set us to be in a minimum eccentricity orbit. Now, if I time warp around over to here, when we come out of time warp, notice it's going to correct us again. That says we have a 0.477 second period error, probably because of that thing I did. Oh, now I've corrected it back down to 0.132. And now if we look, now it's 2863 to 2863, 317, 379. Now you can bat these around all you want. We could go do another correction. I'm going to get this guy really very close to circular before we put up the next one. Not that important because they're not actually going. Oh, notice it bipped it just slightly and these moved. 313, 360. That is about as close as I want to get. Hey, let's go get the second one. Now, if I were to sit here and just turn on time warp, if this is truly curvosynchronous, then Kerbin shouldn't be rotating behind there. Want to try it? Let's try it. Except my camera is rotating. How do I get the camera to stay pointed at Kerbin? I don't know how to get the camera to, I don't know how to get the camera to keep Kerbin centered. There must be, oh, wait a minute. If I lock it, chase locked. Oh, right, locked isn't going to work because I am not keeping my space. If my spacecraft was oriented so that one of the antennas was always pointed to Kerbin, I could use locked. But I think this peninsula is going to be dead centered for me. Let's turn it up some. Yeah, now you can tell. I'm not going to be able to tell if Kerbin is moving slowly or not. But I think that peninsula is staying roughly underneath me. Yeah, there's that peninsula again. Okay, so we are kerbosynchronous to within some very small margin of error. Let's get 060 launched. So 36 minutes into the video and I'm launching the second satellite. Now, if things work, I'll just do the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. Just boom, 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 boom. So to launch the second one, we just change the name. I'm going to make them 60 degrees apart. I have 6 of them. I've gone as few in the past as if you can go all the way down to 3 satellites. The risk there is if any satellite starts to move out of place, you can lose your constellation. 6 is really kind of nice. 4 is solid. Could do 5 as well. Hey, let's do 5. Let's do 5, just for grins. So 360, which means this is 72 degrees per. So 072. Just off the top of my head, I'm going to say put this one at 72 degrees. And we don't need to save him because all we're doing is we're changing his assignment to 72. I probably should have set this up to do a better job of time warping. Now, we haven't launched this plan yet. This is using the generic follower. So what he's going to do is he is going to launch into a lower altitude orbit. And it basically is going to be using the same logic as the rescue mission for that. So we're going to go into a lower orbit, and we're going to park in that orbit until we can do a transition up to match him. But now we have a phase offset. So the code that said, I'm going to launch to a standoff point. So remember, we were launching to rescue, and we wanted to hit a point that was not, we didn't want to like run into him. We wanted to launch to a point that was a ways away. What we finally settled on was a certain distance toward the body. So it's a calculated standoff point. Well, now our standoff point calculation takes into account a phase offset. So when you say calculate the standoff point to rendezvous with this guy at a given time, what it does is it says, oh, your phase is 60, so I'm going to take your period, and I'm going to divide that by 360 and multiply it by your phase, which is 60, and that way, that much forward. And I'm going to say that time forward, that's the time I'm going to use to figure out the position and the velocity of my destination. So my destination is 60 degrees ahead of him. We won't see anything along that lines until after we've gotten ourselves in the orbit. But once we get into orbit, we'll plan a transfer using Lambert solutions. It'll be a nice Holman transfer, which will send us out, and it will join up with this orbit 60 degrees ahead of 72 degrees ahead of CO3, 000. So 72 degrees ahead of my lead element. And we can even have MechJeb tell us orbit info and target orbit info. Those will become interesting when we get there. What is my target orbit? period is 5 hours, 59 minutes, and 9 seconds. The sidereal day of Kerbin, where it goes around, I think it's sidereal. The period of Kerbin where it goes around once relative to the stars is 5 hours, 59 minutes, and just under 9 seconds. The 6-hour period is sun to sun, but that's because in a year you get an extra sun to sun time, so it's a little shorter. So each day, the sun is in the position above you just before you get the stars back to where they were. Okay? By about a minute on Kerbin. Anyway, this 5:59:09 is something we'll see a lot. I think it's 08.6 or something. Anyway, this is actually, we picked that up by looking at Kerbin's orbital period. Notice our 2863, eccentricity is 0. Now the inclination, I hit N, which fired my RCS jets, I believe, upward. So it gave us a little bit of inclination. Yeah. Oops. So we will be actually matching that inclination as part of our maneuvers here. And there's our transfer. We had to go around a few times to get everything in position. And it had several alternatives. It had several potential times it could have done that. And it picked the one that had the least burn, probably because this one has the least inclination change it has to make. It certainly looks like it. Okay, there's our transfer orbit. Oh, and I've adjusted the maneuver node firing. It used to be that we took our burn time, a computed burn time, and half of that before the instant. That didn't take into account the fact that at the end of the burn, we decrease our throttle gracefully. So I did a little bit of math and figured out that if we started the burn a second and a half before that, for these longer burns, it came out much better. So you notice that we do have a correction burn, but it's way late in the orbit, which means it's a fairly small correction. It is a 27 meters per second correction out here. But we had to go out here to get it to work right. It looks like it is... What direction is that going? It's mostly prograde. Prograde a little in and a little up. So we are doing a bit of a plane shift here. Now, did I print out anything about that? Yeah, I didn't print out anything about the correction. Just that I was correcting. So you notice here our target information. Target orbit info. I guess it's... No, it wasn't that. It is rendezvous info that we want. There we go. So phase angle is 287.77. So 72 degrees, it would be 287 would have been perfect. No, 288 would have been perfect. So we're pretty close to the right phase angle. A more advanced satellite would adjust its SMA slightly to sneak back into position. But that presumes that when it gets near position, KOS is focused on it so that it can finish its correction maneuver. And there's CurbNet beginning to show up. Here's our first connection between satellites. So we've circularized, and there's our recircularization adjustment going. And now we pose. And if necessary, we're going to do a brief burst on the RCS jets, and we are at 0.114 seconds period error. So if we look at our rendezvous info, synodic period with the other, if we have the other satellite targeted, the synodic period means that we will lap them, we will go around completely relative to them in 442 years. So that's a little less than 1 degree of error every year. So in 50 years, we'll be off by 50 degrees. So that's per year. Our satellite constellations may last that long, so we may want to do some tweaking in future versions of the satellite code to have it readjust that. So if our errors get big, it can flip it so it goes back in the other direction, and just set an alarm or something so every year or so we go back and visit all of our satellites and have them refigure how they want to adjust their orbital periods to stay within their assigned window. So let's do the next one. Space Center. So that was 72. So the next one is 144. Yes, I definitely should have rebooted the computer before starting the stream. KSP is taking quite a while to change scenes. I've been playing a lot of KSP-2 lately, and I do know that they've done a lot of work on moving things to the launch pad, so I may just be getting really used to the time that it takes KSP-2 to do that transition. So next one is 144. You can tell I'm not a professional YouTuber. There's a lot of dead air. A lot of things aren't planned. I have no background music. I have no catchphrase. I have no theming. I am going to, well, he's already targeted. Typically, yeah, this script starts out by targeting the lead element, so I'll just leave that targeted. And we'll leave these 3 windows up. Where we are, where we're going, and the relative orbit. So we can see that the line out here is a double line, which means that my satellites are not in exactly the same inclination orbit. So there's another thing for our microcode. So the code on the satellites, we're already maintaining our SMA to get our period right. We are minimizing our eccentricity. So, do we want to correct our inclination? I don't know. I have done inclination correction before, where when you're getting close to the target plane, you apply acceleration perpendicular to the target plane, and that brings your inclination into line with it. Thing is that inclination changes are recognizably expensive. So for very small changes like this, I mean, literally, I blipped the N key. It's going to take that much of a blip to get back into place. But in general, if our inclination is wrong, I am inclined to leave it alone. So I'm going to just, allow this. So we are not going to be actually kerbo-stationary. We are going to wobble a little around in the sky. We're not going to be perfectly circular. We're not going to be perfectly equatorial. But that's okay, because our purpose here is to get the satellites talking to each other and providing coverage. This is the first ring. We are going to need another ring of satellites. No, not need, but I would like to do is put another ring of satellites out somewhere between the orbit of Mun and Minmus, just for fun. The challenge is going to be getting out there without getting a encounter with Mun on the way. Now, maybe the smart move there is to, instead of having our longer distance satellites be equatorial plane out here, would be to do a Molina orbit modification, to where we actually do a polar orbit, where we put 3 satellites in a polar orbit with periapsis down below the South Pole and apoapsis way up high, which means that at any given time we'll have 2 or 3, 2 satellites up high, and then 3 more satellites going down below. That'll be an entirely different kind of a launch. It'll be polar launch, and then extending our orbit at the poles, and then trying to control where our periapsis is. Again, our code here that gets us into the same orbit will come in very handy. Especially if the perigee is, not too close. There's our 670 meter per second delta V. And you can already see where it's going to show up. So these guys are going to get around to here. Now, when I was doing these by hand, I didn't launch 0. I launched a reference satellite, and then I would launch from KSC when the reference satellite was at some phase angle from me. And so, the launch where the reference satellite was just overhead didn't end up being at the reference satellite. So your assigned guys went up, and then you bring your reference satellite back down because it would be in an odd location. And it was only a marker anyway. So this time we had an early correction maneuver. Again, we are still trying to match orbits with this guy that has a bit of an inclined orbit. Now, just like the rescue missions, if this correction we just did wasn't good enough, we would plan another one. Apparently it was good enough because we are going ahead and heading up to our destination. So 430 some odd meters per second to circularize. Rendezvous info is telling us phase angle is 214, so we're at 144. 144 and 214 is 358. Close enough. Remember, the planning we're doing is not to land us at this orbit. We're actually, our Lambert planning, no, our Lambert planning is to that exact point. So I'm not exactly sure why we're getting errors. So I do the planning, and I place my end point as close as possible to where we're headed, that phase angle. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. The trajectory that the Lambert planning gives us should place us dead on, which means that I've got a systemic error in how I'm doing my burns, resulting in us being at slightly the wrong location. Possibly a combination of the transfer error and, once we get there, getting circularized properly. So, in our case, our synodic period is 322 years. So again, about a degree a year off. Okay, that was 144. Let's go launch the next one. Okay, so another 72 degrees. It's really nice that I don't have to create scripts or even edit scripts for this. So this is going to be 216. I just change the name and everything works. I'm going to run really quick to get something to drink. So let's see. Was there anything interesting about the code to do this? Well, let's bring it up and take a look real quick. Go through the new script. See if there was anything cool. Configure. This mostly is right out of the rescue mission. Configure. Wait for the ascending node. Countdown. Launch. Ascent. Coast. Map view. Circularize. It's all normal. Plane change. Normal. The rescue mission posed for 30 seconds. On the plane change, I reduced that because I was getting ticked off at it. Plan the transfer. And then we have our little loop that says go, execute the maneuver node, plan a correction node. If we got a node, go back to go again. The difference now is that after we do the maneuver node execution, I am doing the lighten. So we plan our transfer and we execute it, and then we lighten the ship. So we only have our last stage. If we have a correction, we go back and do it again. Lighten's going to be a no-op because we've already staged it away. We do our circularization phase, which says plan, execute the plan, and then tune up the circle. And the hold code is exactly the same. And I didn't go back and re-verify target SMA and target altitude, but I believe, well, it's working as expected. SMA altitude, target altitude is SMA minus R0, assigned period error, target SMA. Okay, this is all good. If it wasn't, it wouldn't have been working this well. So you notice we have the bright green lines headed down to Kerbin. So those are the ground station connections to our satellites. We have dim lines going between satellites. And then I've got this red line. I believe that's because the antennas I have on these guys can barely reach from there to there. Did I misplan this? Do we have the wrong kinds of antennas? I'm just thinking here. Okay, so our target distance is 6 million meters, 6.3 million meters. So the question is, do the antennas I am using reach that far? Can one of these or two of these successfully set up a curb net connection that far? I mean, it doesn't really matter too much since we have the constellation, but we are going to be trying to communicate much further out. So am I going to need to replace these satellites shortly with satellites that have another antenna for longer distance communication? Or is that going to be the job of my polar satellites to go up here, be way up here, and have the really huge dishes that talk back? And I just realized if I've got really huge dishes above and below the plane, did I really need the circle anyway? It was a good proof of concept. What this does mean, though, is I can create any satellite I want and launch it as C/03/degrees and have it placed in an appropriate slot on this turbosynchronous orbit ring. Okay, so this orbit is 0.1 seconds, synodic period 472 years, so again, yeah, degree a year. So all these guys look like I could basically ignore this constellation for 10 years of in-game time. And since we're year 1, day 74, 10 years is a long time for one of these constellations. So we don't need to be working on that correction code very quickly. So 6.3 million meters. I'll have to look up the formula for how far these antennae will stretch. So he's in place. And the last satellite. Tick, 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 tick. Come on. So 72, 21, that'd be 290. No. $71 to be 288. Yes. Yeah, that's right. So while this is launching, I'm going to bring up a web browser and see if I can figure out, let's see, KSP satellite ranges. These are, I think these are HG5s. Can I ask the antenna what its power rating is? So this antenna rating is 5.0 M. So 5M to a 5M is 5 million meters. So indeed, this means I need quite a bit more antenna to be able to talk out to up beyond Minmus. So Minmus is at 46 million meters. So looking at the range calculation table in the wiki, I am seeing that, well, this is 5M 5M rated. If I get a 2G rated antenna here talking to 2G there, that works. A 5M talking to 2G also works. So we do have to look at larger antennas. So these are 5M antennas. A 2G would get these guys talking out past Minmus. So we could have satellites around Minmus with at least one of them having, well, somebody that could relay with a 2G on it. So I'm thinking the red links are, there could be a link here if it was closer, but it's out of range. Kind of be a colorful display then. So there is some math here for combining antennas. Basically, the vessel, so the range between two vessels, the allowed range between them is the square root of the product of their ratings. And the vessel power, if you've got multiple antennas, is the strongest power times the ratio of the sum of the powers over the strongest power to some exponent. So if we've got two 5M antennas, it'd be 5M times 2 to some power. And average compatibility exponent is the average of the combinability exponent values of all this. It is combinable, but it's not telling me the exponent here. Anyway, so there's an exponent associated with the antenna. Which is probably less than 1. Okay. Not finding. Right, there's another calculator. ComNet calculator. Oh, that's not what I want. Anyway, we are online. We have our antennae. We're talking. I think I'm going to call that. So stream is done. I am going to head back to the Space Center, and I'll put a stopper on this one. Not sure why I went back to the VAB. Okay, there's what I wanted to show. There is my new satellite network, and I'm being offered a launch into that orbit. I'm going to go ahead and deorbit the debris. Some of it will deorbit on its own. Let's turn off the relays. There we go. And that's a stream. See you next time.